Have you heard about the Cessna 340 crash in San Diego that I talked about yesterday in episode 300? And do you know how to do a circle-to-land approach and how to ask for a visual approach? And if you heard the story, did you wonder why this accident pilot asked the approach controller, "Am I clear for runway 23?" when he wasn't even yet established on the ILS 28 right approach? Now, that transmission really bugged me, so I spent several hours reanalyzing the data and now have a simple explanation for the pilot's behavior. And it ties in directly with the deficits in his instrument proficiency checks that I mentioned yesterday. Sadly, it appears to be a case of a pilot who lacks some critical knowledge on how to fly two different types of instrument approaches and who failed to communicate properly with ATC. Please stick around and I'll explain. Hello again and welcome to Aviation News Talk. My name is Max Trescott. I've been flying for 50 years. I'm the author of several books, and I'm the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. And my mission is to help you become the safest possible pilot. If you're new to the show, take a moment right now and touch either the subscribe key or, if you're using the Apple Podcast app, the follow key so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. And if you didn't hear yesterday's episode, you may want to stop, go back now to listen to it to get the full background on the accident, and then return to this episode. You can find it at aviationnewstalk.com/300. But if you want to continue listening now, I'll quickly summarize yesterday's episode by saying that a pilot flying the ILS 28 right with a circle to land to runway 23 at Montgomery Field in San Diego failed to join the localizer. And just at the moment that he reached the localizer, he began to turn to the right. The controller noticed this, canceled his approach clearance, and issued a series of vectors and climb instructions that the pilot failed to follow before crashing into terrain. The NTSB probable cause was loss of control due to spatial disorientation. This is certainly what happened, but it doesn't tell us why it happened. NTSB reports are great at reporting the facts of what happened, but it's left to us as readers of the reports to put ourselves in the shoes of the pilot and try to figure out why it happened. Now, when there's a cockpit voice recorder in the airplane, as there was in the Pilatus PC-12 that crashed in North Carolina, it's a lot easier to get into the heads of the pilots and figure out the why. In this particular case, the why of the accident was a little harder to figure out. One of the major questions in my mind was why, at just the point the pilot was joining the localizer, did he turn back to the right instead of joining the localizer? My first thought was that the pilot didn't understand how to use his equipment, and the NTSB report actually steered me in that direction. It mentioned that 11 months prior to the accident, the plane had a complete new set of Garmin avionics installed, and that the pilot's logbooks didn't reflect any training on that equipment. The logbook also showed that during the prior 11 months, there were just 2 training events in the airplane. The 2 flights, one in February and one in October, both resulted in the pilot receiving 2 endorsements, one for an IPC and one for a flight review. But as I explained in episode 300, the training logged did not meet the FAA requirements for either of the IPCs, and it didn't meet the requirements for the second flight review. Crucially, neither IPC included a circle-to-land approach, even though the FAA requires one in order to receive an IPC endorsement. And as I'll explain in a moment, that training deficiency relates directly to this accident. You can draw a straight line between the two. Because of these training deficiencies, I suggested yesterday that it's possible the pilot didn't understand his equipment well and made some error that caused the airplane to turn back to the right and fail to join the localizer. While giving flight instruction, I've seen many of these kinds of user errors, and they often occur right at the point where the aircraft should be joining the localizer. But there was one problem with attributing this turn to the right to user error. I can think of a couple of different user errors in which the aircraft will continue to fly through the localizer, but I can only think of one error where the pilot would turn back to the right just as he or she was joining the localizer. That error occurs when people are using the moving map for primary guidance, which isn't permitted. Instead, you're supposed to use the HSI or CDI needle for primary guidance. In cases where pilots are using the moving map, they may turn early before joining the localizer, but their turn to the right is just enough to parallel the localizer. They then use the map to stay close to the line while paralleling it. Now, please don't do that, as there's no way to know if you're staying within the confines of the localizer by looking only at the moving map. You must look at your HSI or CDI needle. But this pilot didn't turn to the right and parallel the course. Just as he should have joined the final approach course, he turned right and rolled out onto a heading that diverged on a 20-degree angle to the right of the localizer. So the question still lingering in my mind after releasing episode 300 was why the pilot turned to the right. I was also left wondering about one of his radio transmissions, which didn't make a lot of sense. I didn't get into this yesterday, as pilots often have difficulty with radio communications. Let me replay a couple of the radio transmissions, and then I'll comment on them.
Air 22 Golf, turn right heading 250, join final.
250, join final for 2 Golf. And 2 Golf, do you say clear for the ILS to it, right?
Air 22 Golf, you're 4 miles from Penny, descend and maintain 2,800 until established on the localizer. Clear to ILS, runway 28 right, circle to land, runway 23.
Clear for the ILS to it, right? For runway 23, 2 Golf.
Yes, sir. Descend and maintain 2,800 until established on the localizer.
2,800 till established on the localizer, 2 Golf.
This transmission suggested to me that this pilot, like many pilots I've encountered, was confused by the difference between the instructions join the approach or join the localizer, or in this case, join the final, and the instruction cleared for the approach. The two instructions are different, and the buttons you push on the autopilot will also be different. The first instruction means exactly what it says. As you intercept the final approach course, turn to join it. For most autopilots, when you hear this instruction, you should push the nav button. That way, when you reach the final, the autopilot will turn the airplane to join and track the final. Now, pilots are less familiar with the join instruction and often expect to hear cleared for the approach. The difference is that when you're instructed to join the approach, you turn onto the final approach course, but you remain at the last altitude you are assigned. You are not permitted to descend, even if the instrument approach chart shows a lower altitude for the approach segment that you're on, because you are not yet cleared for the approach. Now, there are a variety of reasons a controller may ask you to join an approach rather than clear you for an approach. For example, there may be traffic passing below you, and if you were to descend after joining the approach, you might be in conflict with that traffic. So in that case, a controller would clear you to join the approach, believing that you know that you're not permitted to descend. Later, after the traffic passes from the area, you'll be cleared for the approach, at which point you can descend to the published altitude for the approach segment you're on and push the APR or approach key on your autopilot. But most of the time, you won't be asked to join the approach, you'll just be cleared for the approach. And that occurs because all the requirements have been met for the controller to clear you for the approach. Now, I teach clients that when they hear the words clear for the approach, that should be a trigger for them to go out and push the APR key. On most autopilots, the difference between the nav key and the APR key is that the APR key allows you to couple to a glide slope or a glide path, whereas the nav key does not. Now let's go back to the audio.
Your 22 Golf, looks like you're drifting right of course. Are you correcting?
Correcting for 2 Golf. So, 2 Golf clear for runway 23.
22 Golf, you're not even tracking the localizer. I need you to fly. It's actually cancel approach clearance, climb and maintain 3,000. 22 Golf.
3,000, 2 Golf.
Maintain 3,000. Low altitude alert, minimum vector altitude in your area, 2,800.
Climbing 2 Golf.
The controller noted that the aircraft was turning away from the localizer and asked if the pilot was correcting. Oddly, the pilot said that he was correcting, but he wasn't. To do that, he would have to turn back to the left, but he continued to fly at a 20-degree angle to the right away from the localizer. The comment that he was correcting was probably just a reflex. Pilots like to comply with ATC instructions, and sometimes without giving much thought to an answer, they'll just read back something to suggest that they'll comply with the controller's instruction. However, this pilot must have quickly realized that he wasn't correcting and in fact didn't want to correct back to the localizer, at which point he asked the cryptic question, is 22 Golf cleared for runway 23? When I first heard that, I thought, wow, this pilot really lacks an understanding of ATC processes, especially as related to flying a circle-to-land approach. And I at first attributed his comment to being a poorly phrased repeat of his earlier question, am I cleared for the approach? Which didn't make a lot of sense to me, as he'd already been told he was cleared for the approach, but perhaps he'd forgotten and was just reconfirming, which is always a good idea. The controller certainly interpreted that way and pointed out that the pilot was still not on the approach. At this point, the plane was getting close to the final approach fix, was flying away from the approach, and in a slightly exasperated tone, the controller told the pilot that the approach clearance was canceled and to fly vectors for a second approach. But after looking again at the flight tracks and the points along the track at which each of these transmissions occurred, and at the weather, I'm convinced that the problem was that the pilot knew what he wanted, but he didn't know how to ask for it, and the controller didn't understand what the pilot was asking for because the question was so poorly formed. I'm now convinced that the reason the pilot never joined the localizer was because at the moment he should have joined the localizer, he broke out of the clouds and had the runway in sight. Instead of turning 30 degrees to the right to join the localizer, which he should have done, he turned about 50 degrees to the right so that he was now diverging from the localizer at about a 20-degree angle. Because he had the airport in sight, he made this turn to the right so that he could make a left base entry to runway 23. All of that would have been fine, but the pilot lacked a basic understanding of how to fly a circle-to-land approach, quite likely because he wasn't made to fly one on his prior 2 IPCs, even though that's a requirement for getting an IPC. Now let me talk briefly about the weather, and then I'll talk about how to fly a circle-to-land approach and why this pilot's question was confusing the controller. And by the way, I'm not at all surprised it confused the controller, as it confused me for a day until I looked at the data again. The weather at the destination, Montgomery Field, was reported as ceilings broken at 1,700 feet and overcast at 2,800 feet. Now note that weather at an airport is always reported as AGL, not MSL, so you need to make a conversion to calculate the MSL heights of the clouds. Since the field elevation is 427 feet, we'll just add 400 feet to get a rough idea where the clouds really were. That translates to a broken layer at roughly 2,100 feet and an overcast layer at roughly 3,200 feet. We should also note that the pilot was flying west while descending over mountains to the east of the field. Now, where I live, which has somewhat similar terrain to San Diego, we usually see lower clouds over the airports near the coast, and those cloud bases rise as you go further east toward the mountains. So it's a good bet that the cloud bases were higher along the instrument approach than they were at the airport. About 11:11 a.m., the pilot reached the point where he should have joined the localizer. At that point, he was a little over a mile outside the final approach fix Penny. He was at about 3,300 feet and descending and doing 161 knots ground speed. He turned to the right, most likely because he had broken out of a cloud layer and had the airport in sight. It's at this point that the ground track becomes slightly more wobbly, suggesting that the pilot disconnected the autopilot when he spotted the airport and began hand flying toward runway 23. 25 seconds later, the controller reported that the pilot was right of the localizer. The plane was now at 2,400 feet and 193 knots. 17 seconds later, the pilot asked, "Is 22 Golf cleared for runway 23? At that point, he was at about 2,200 feet at 175 knots. So all available evidence points to a pilot who broke out of the clouds at about 7.7 miles from the airport, spotted the airport, disconnected the autopilot, and started flying visually toward runway 23. Unfortunately, this is not how to fly a circle-to-land approach, so the controller was understandably confused as to why the pilot said, "Is 22 Golf cleared for runway 23?" and why the pilot was not tracking the instrument approach inbound toward the airport. First, it doesn't matter whether the pilot was in IMC or VMC. The procedure for flying a circle-to-land approach is the same regardless of whether you're in the clouds or clear of clouds. As the pilot reached the localizer, he should have turned about 30 degrees to the right to join the localizer and track it to the airport, even if he had the airport in sight. At this point, he was about 1.4 miles outside the final approach fix. Since he was cleared for the approach, as soon as he joined the approach, he should have continued to descend to 2,500 feet, the minimum altitude for that segment. As he reached the final approach fix, he would have intercepted the glide slope and descended to the circling minimums for the approach, which are 920 feet MSL, or just 493 feet AGL for Category B for aircraft flying the approach between 91 and 120 knots. Note that on this approach, circling is not permitted for Category C and D, so the pilot would have needed to slow way down to qualify for circling at Category B minimums. When you look at the circling minimums on the chart, there is no letter C in a black circle, meaning that the circling minimums have not been reevaluated for the new circling criteria that tell you how far you can be from the airport and still remain in this circling protected area. So for this approach, the old criteria for Category B of 1.5 miles applies. So to remain safe, the pilot would have to descend to the circling minimums of 920 feet. Then, when he was within 1.5 miles of the runway, he could have left the ILS final approach course, turned to the right, and joined a base leg to runway 23. And that's the procedure he would likely have followed had he been given the required circle-to-land approach during his 2 prior IPCs. But there's another way the pilot could have flown the approach, which was essentially the way he was flying it, but he lacked a proper clearance and a proper understanding of the clearance required for what he was trying to do. There are at least 2 things the pilot could have done when he broke out of the cloud that would have permitted him to do what he was trying to do. First, anytime you're in VMC conditions, you can cancel IFR and fly any path you'd like to the airport under VFR rules. But there are some limitations to this, so it's probably not the best strategy. One limitation is that you'll have to meet all VFR cloud clearance requirements. So after breaking out of the clouds, you'll have to continue descending an additional 500 feet before canceling IFR. Otherwise, you won't have the 500-foot vertical separation required between you and the clouds when flying VFR. Also, if there are any other clouds between you and the airport, you'll need to stay at least 1,000 feet above them and 2,000 feet horizontally from them. And if you were to accidentally go back into the clouds, you'd no longer be on an IFR clearance, so it would be a bit of a scramble to explain that to ATC and to get a new clearance. So canceling IFR is not always the best solution, though it works well if there are few clouds between you and the airport. Now, a much better solution is to request a visual approach, as it gives you more flexibility. Per the FAA, a visual approach is an ATC authorization for an aircraft on an IFR flight plan to proceed visually and clear of clouds to the airport of intended landing. A visual approach is not a standard instrument approach procedure and has no missed approach segment. An aircraft unable to complete a landing from a visual approach must be handled as any go-arounds, and appropriate IFR separation must be provided until the aircraft lands or the pilot cancels their IFR flight plan. So to fly a visual approach, the weather at the destination airport must be at least 1,000 feet overcast with 3 miles of visibility. Also, you must have either the airport in sight or the preceding aircraft in sight. Once you report the field in sight and ATC has resolved any traffic conflicts, the controller can clear you for the visual approach. At towered airports, a runway must be specified, so you might hear, "Cleared visual approach, runway 23. That authorizes you to maneuver as you see fit to land on that runway. Later, you'll be switched to tower for your landing clearance. Getting a visual approach is a simple thing. At any point on an IFR flight, a pilot can simply say, "Airport in sight." This lets the controller know that most likely you'd like a visual approach. In this case, when the accident pilot broke out of the clouds, all the pilot had to say was "Airport in sight," and the controller would have cleared him for the visual approach to runway 23, which is what the pilot was trying to do anyway. Imagine the frustration of both the pilot and the controller when the controller said to cancel the approach clearance and follow vectors for a second attempt at the approach. At that moment, the plane was about 5.6 miles from the runway. The pilot saw the airport, was just a couple of minutes from landing, but he was being told to climb back up into the clouds to try it again. The controller, who sounded frustrated when he canceled the approach, had probably seen other pilots successfully fly the approach that day and didn't understand why this pilot couldn't fly the approach as published. So oddly, there was a miscommunication between the pilot and the controller because the pilot didn't understand how to properly fly a circle to land approach, and because he didn't understand that he needed to be re-cleared, this time for a visual approach, when he started flying toward runway 23. And what makes this all the more distressing is that the logbook entries for his 2 most recent IPCs show that he wasn't made to fly a circle to land approach. Had that been done, he undoubtedly would have known more about the proper procedures for flying a circle to land, and we wouldn't be talking about this accident today. So I encourage you to seek out the best possible training you can and to try to learn everything you can about aviation, because you never know what small detail that you don't know might trip you up and lead to an accident. And if you'd like to fly with me, I'd be happy to do that with you. But even if we never do get the chance to fly together, there's still a lot that you could learn from me by buying one of my books. I'll be back with more of the show in just a moment. First, let me ask you, are you flying an airplane equipped with the Garmin G1000 Perspective or the G3000 or G5000? If so, do you know everything there is to know about the system and its autopilot? I'm sure you've read the POH for your airplane from cover to cover, but have you done that for your avionics? Even if you know a lot about the G1000 or G3000 and the autopilot, there's probably more to learn, and you certainly don't want to be struggling to figure out the nuances of the system as you're flying in the clouds. People who've read my books tell me they are much easier to read than the Garmin manuals, plus they have a great index, so it's easy to look up any feature you're trying to figure out. To truly master a plane, you have to also master the avionics. So call to get my Max Trust Guts G1000 and Perspective Glass Cockpit Handbook or my Max Trust Guts G3000 and G5000 Glass Cockpit Handbook. The former is $34.95 and the latter is $44.95. Commit to doing that now and call 800-247-6553 to order. And let's go to some email. My thanks to listener Bryce Dill for an email he sent after listening to episode 300 relating to my discussion about the requirements for an IPC or instrument proficiency check. He felt that I could have better worded the requirement for the need to fly a DME ARC on an IPC or during a check ride, and I agree. He pointed out that in the instrument ACS that we were discussing, there's a line on page A15 that says, quote, an ARC may only be flown if it's charted and available. So if you don't have a nearby approach with a DME ARC, you don't have to perform that requirement on an IPC or a check ride. But as part of your own training, and as I suggested, you may want to work with your CFI to see how to fly a random DME ARC that you can create off of any VOR. Bryce, thanks so much for your email. And thanks to listener Shay Myers, who came to the same conclusion I did about the accident pilot trying to fly a visual approach to 2-3. While working on today's episode, he wrote, something stood out to me in the way the pilot asked ATC if he was cleared to land at runway 23. It seems possible that the pilot may have been entering VMC, and upon seeing the ground was beginning to move right of the localizer as part of the circle to land runway 23. I recognize that if that was the case, he should have said field in sight, and maybe he was confused that he had said option. Yes, Shay, that's spot on. We agree that that's what he was doing and that he didn't know the proper way to get what he wanted. In times of stress, pilots don't rise to the occasion, but rather they fall down to their level of training. And as we've pointed out, he didn't get the training he was supposed to have gotten on circling approaches. And listener Lou Nawakas wrote, just listen to episode 300 regarding the unfortunate San Diego 340 crash. As you noted the deficiencies in the pilot's logbook, I was wondering, did the investigation include interviews with the CFIs who provided the training, flight reviews, and IPCs? Are there consequences to those who provided pencil-whipped endorsements and or substandard reviews? Thank you for all that you do for the aviation community with these in-depth reviews. It contributes to a safer sky, and we're all better for it. Well, Lou, hello to you out there in Morris County, New Jersey, where I spent my first 7 years after college working for Hewlett-Packard in Rockaway. I certainly enjoyed my time there. To answer your questions, if any of the accident pilot CFIs were interviewed, those notes don't appear in the NTSB docket. There are records of a number of interviews with people who witnessed the accidents. And as for penalties for pencil-whipped endorsements, that's easy to determine. I had an older copy, but I looked it up and see that the FAA's Compliance and Enforcement Order 2150.3C was just updated in August. The older B version of that document says that certificate action for false endorsement of any student pilot record is revocation. So you'd lose your certificate. But oddly, the new C version that I just downloaded does not spell out a penalty, so who knows? And listener Arthur Rosen writes, I used to fly from Scottsdale to Montgomery Field every week in the summer. Unfortunately, in one sense, I never had an autopilot in any of my airplanes. Fortunately, I was proficient in hand flying. ATC always gave vectors and the step-downs to intercept the ILS for 28 right. Usually I had to go through a marine layer to get into and out of MYF. I always tell my friends when they have a problem with the automation to turn everything off and hand fly. Yes, I agree with you, Arthur. When you get an autopilot issue, turn it off and hand fly, which unfortunately didn't help this accident pilot. And Clinton, Ohio writes, I hope this finds you well. Love the podcast. I have an opportunity to fly a Phenom 300, which has a Garmin G3000, and wondered if your G3000 book would help with someone who has no G1000 or G3000 experience. Most advanced GPSs I've used to date is the 650XI. I'm guessing the answer is yes, but if your book only covers more advanced operations, I might get lost, so wanted to check. Well, Clint, thanks for checking. All of the books take you from 0 to 100, so they're appropriate for both beginner and advanced pilots. And have fun flying the Phenom 300. I got an SIC rating and a Phenom 100, and those are great airplanes. And now here's some quick follow-ups to stories that I mentioned yesterday. The 3-day TFR in effect over the San Francisco Bay Area has really kept the skies clear and quiet, as no flight training is permitted while the president and foreign leaders are in town for the APEC convention. I also mentioned that prices are sky high for pilots flying into Las Vegas this week and next for the F1 Grand Prix event, In response, AOPA sent me an email today letting us know that there have been some positive changes. Clark County, which operates 5 airports in and around Las Vegas, has announced a price reduction. Previously, special event fees at Henderson and North Las Vegas were posted at $3,000 for all aircraft. Now the county has found 40 spots that can accommodate smaller Group 1 aircraft, and they're offering these for $750, which is a 75% discount. Piston twins like the Cessna 421 or Piper Chieftain are examples of Group 1 aircraft. Pilots who've already paid the $3,000 will be able to get a refund. And thanks for those of you who've asked about my allergenic reaction to a penicillin skin test that I took a week ago that turned virtually my entire body red. Happily this evening, I noticed one little part of my body that's now a little less red, so perhaps I'm turning the corner on this. And nonetheless, I'm still planning to audition for the lead role in the sequel to The Martian, so watch out, Matt Damon, I'm still coming after you. The good news is that this has been giving me a little more time to work on podcasts this week since I'm grounded from flying. I hope that you've been enjoying these shows and that you'll help us by taking a moment right now just to take the time to send a link to the show to 1 or 2 of your friends and then encourage them to subscribe. Just send them the following link, aviationnewstalk.com/301. And just a reminder that I love hearing from you and I read many of your emails on the show. If you'd like to send me a message, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page. That's absolutely the best way to send me a message. And of course, I also want to thank everyone who supports the show in one of the following ways. We love it when you join the club and sign up at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome to support the show financially. You can also do that at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. We also love it when you leave a 5-star review on whatever app that you're listening to us on now. And of course, if you're in the market for a headset, please consider buying a Lightspeed headset and using one of the links in our show notes, because if you use those links, they will donate to help support the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.
You can always go around. If it don't look right coming down, don't wait until your side's maybe sliding upside down.